The flight attendant stormed down the aisle, her face tight with frustration. She came to an abrupt stop at seat 3A, her eyes locking onto a passenger who exuded an air of quiet authority. "I need to see your ticket," she barked, her tone edged with impatience. What she couldn't have imagined was that the woman before her was far more than an ordinary flyer. She was the secret owner of the airline, a fact unknown to everyone on board. In that charged moment, as whispers began to ripple through the cabin and anticipation mounted like a brewing storm, a hidden power shifted the balance. The subtle defiance in the passenger's gaze foretold an impending upheaval that would soon shatter the flight attendant's meticulously maintained world. Before we dive into the tale, drop a comment below and tell us which part of the globe you're joining from today. And if you're captivated by stories like this, be sure to hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you're always in the know when a new adventure unfolds. The first-class cabin was quiet, the kind of stillness that came just before takeoff. While passengers settled into their luxurious seats, some meticulously adjusting their positions, others lost in the glow of their personal screens or savoring slow, deliberate sips of their complimentary beverages, a singular presence quietly captivated the space. Seated gracefully by the window, a woman observed the unfolding scene with an air of quiet vigilance. Her eyes seemed to capture every nuance of the cabin, reflecting both alertness and an enigmatic calm. Her name was Aurora Blackwell, a moniker that, if recognized, was met with deliberate indifference by those who preferred not to acknowledge her. Aurora's refined demeanor spoke volumes without uttering a word. She eschewed the fanfare of an entourage and shunned overt displays of wealth. Instead, her influence flowed silently and powerfully, quietly steering entire industries from behind a veil of understated elegance. Clad in a sleek black turtleneck and impeccably fitted trousers, her style was both minimalist and magnetic, with only a delicate, custom-crafted gold bracelet hinting at the profound legacy and authority she wielded. Amid the gentle hum of conversation, a determined flight attendant broke through the calm as she made her way down the aisle, pausing methodically at each seat to ensure everything was in perfect order. This was Isadora Fenwick, a woman whose commanding presence and practiced professionalism were etched into every sharp feature and every carefully rehearsed smile. She had been working for this airline for years and had built a reputation for being strict, efficient, and sometimes a little too assertive when it came to enforcing rules. As she approached Aurora's seat, she slowed her gaze, narrowing slightly. Glancing briefly at Aurora, she then shifted her attention to the small leather bag tucked neatly beneath the seat in front, a detail that made her pause, as if stirred by a subtle premonition. With a slight tilt of her head, she addressed the passenger in a measured tone. "Excuse me, Miss Isadora," she said, her words carrying an unexpected insistence that left Aurora momentarily taken aback, especially since no one else had been approached in such a manner. Across the aisle, an older businessman with salt and pepper hair sipped his champagne with unruffled ease, while a woman a few seats ahead casually flipped through a magazine. Yet here, the air around Aurora seemed charged with an unspoken intensity. Without a hint of protest, Aurora reached into her bag and retrieved her boarding pass with deliberate calm, handing it over as if accepting a necessary formality. Isadora examined the document carefully, seat 3A, first-class ticket, and though everything appeared in order, she lingered for a beat before speaking again. "Are you sure this is your seat?" she asked, her voice even but firm. Aurora exhaled slowly, keeping her tone measured. "That's what the ticket says," she replied coolly, though her steady calm belied the tension simmering beneath. The flight attendant lingered by her side, her eyes flicking over her shoulder as if silently calling for backup. Just then, Evangeline Caraway passed by, casting a brief inquisitive glance at Isadora before hurrying toward the galley, leaving behind a trail of whispered curiosity. 2 rows back, Lysander Wolfe shifted in his seat, his body language feigning disinterest, even as his eyes betrayed his intrigue. Isadora forced a brittle laugh, an echo of humor that never quite reached her eyes. "I'm just making sure you know that sometimes mistakes happen with seating assignments," she insisted, deliberately choosing the word mistake as if to underscore a hidden implication. Aurora, well accustomed to such veiled interrogations, extended her hand in a gesture of quiet defiance. "If there's an issue, I'd like my ticket back." For a heartbeat, Isadora's grip on the boarding pass tightened, the paper almost trembling in her grasp before she reluctantly relinquished it. With a final, clipped, "Enjoy your flight," she turned and retreated down the aisle, leaving behind an atmosphere charged with unspoken judgment. The air in the cabin felt different now. The silent eyes of other passengers were still on her, but no one said anything. No one ever did. She turned back to the window, watching as the last of the luggage was loaded onto the plane. It was going to be a long flight. What she didn't know yet was that Isadora Fenwick wasn't done with her, and when she came back, things would take a turn that no one on this flight would ever forget. The plane had been in the air for almost an hour, the seatbelt sign long turned off. Most of the passengers had settled in, some watching movies, others dozing off, and a few flipping through magazines. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady background noise that drowned out most conversations. Aurora Blackwell remained in her seat, her fingers resting lightly against the armrest. She had put in her noise-canceling earbuds, though she wasn't listening to anything. Instead, she kept her eyes on the clouds outside the window, letting the altitude press against her thoughts. Then, just as she was beginning to relax, Isadora Fenwick returned. This time, her steps were quicker, her posture tighter. Something had shifted. Her presence alone sent a ripple through the quiet cabin. A few passengers looked up, sensing something was about to happen. Without a word, Isadora stopped at seat 3A, her expression stiff, her lips pressed together in a way that suggested she had made up her mind about something. She folded her arms across her chest. "I need you to come with me," she said, her tone more commanding than before. Aurora looked up slowly, taking a moment before responding. "Excuse me?" Isadora exhaled sharply, her patience clearly wearing thin. "I need to have a conversation with you in private," she repeated. Now passengers nearby exchanged glances, the tension creeping into the air. Lysander Wolfe, the businessman across the aisle, lowered his drink slightly, watching with quiet curiosity. Aurora removed one earbud, tilting her head slightly. "If there's something you need to say, you can say it here." Isadora's nostrils flared. "This isn't a discussion. I'm asking you to step out of your seat." Aurora remained still, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. "And if I don't?" Isadora continued, the muscles in her jaw tightening. "Then, I'll have to involve security when we land." That was when the murmur started. Soft, quiet whispers between passengers. The unease in the cabin thickened. This was no longer just a minor exchange. This was turning into something bigger. Evangeline Caraway, the younger flight attendant, had been standing near the galley when she noticed what was happening. She frowned, setting down a tray, and quickly made her way over. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, looking between Isadora and Aurora before Aurora could respond. Isadora spoke for her. "She's refusing to cooperate." Evangeline blinked, caught off guard by what Isadora said. Isadora didn't answer right away. She hesitated for the first time, as if she didn't expect to be questioned herself. Aurora leaned back in her seat, her eyes never leaving Isadora's. "She hasn't actually said why she wants me to move." "I think we'd all like to hear it," Evangeline said. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. "What's going on?" Passengers were listening now. Even those who had been pretending not to watch were fully tuned in. Isadora shifted on her feet, but she didn't back down. Instead, she took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and spoke clearly. "I don't believe she's supposed to be in this seat." Silence. Aurora exhaled through her nose. "I showed you my ticket." Isadora kept her gaze firm. "And I need to verify it again." A scoff came from a few rows back. One of the passengers, Ophelia Ravenwood, a woman in her mid-30s with glasses and an annoyed expression, shook her head. "You've got to be kidding me." Evangeline's face paled slightly. She looked at Aurora, then back at Isadora. "You already checked her ticket." Isadora didn't answer right away. Evangeline sighed, rubbing her temple. "Look, if there was an issue, we should have handled it before takeoff. We can't keep harassing passengers." Isadora's face turned a shade darker, but she refused to back down. "I am following airline policy." Aurora finally moved, reaching into her bag. She pulled out her ticket, slow and deliberate, and held it up for everyone around her to see. "Here," she said, her voice level. "Go ahead. Verify it, again." Isadora Fenwick hesitated, just a second too long. Evangeline Caraway snatched the ticket before Isadora could, and skimmed over it. A second later, she let out a breath and shot Isadora a look. "She's in the right seat." More murmurs came from passengers. Lysander Wolf sat down his drink entirely, now watching with a raised brow. Isadora's fingers twitched. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. But instead of apologizing, instead of backing away, she made one final mistake. She grabbed Aurora Blackwell's arm. Not hard, not enough to hurt, but enough to be seen, enough to be felt. The gasp that rippled through the cabin was instant. A few passengers actually stood up in shock. Aurora, however, remained perfectly still. Evangeline's face drained of color. Isadora pulled her hand back quickly, as if she had just realized what she had done. But it was too late. Aurora's lips curled slightly, not in a smile, not in anger, but in something far more dangerous. She reached for her phone, her movements calm. Too calm. Isadora took a step back, something in her chest tightening. Aurora pressed a single button on her screen, lifting the phone to her ear, and when she spoke, it wasn't loud. It wasn't a yell. It was controlled. "Gate control, this is Aurora Blackwell, owner of Blackwell Airlines. There's been an incident on Flight 748. Isadora's world started to cave in the moment the words left Aurora's lips. The entire cabin shifted. The tension in the air, already thick, became suffocating. The murmurs from passengers stopped. Every eye in the first-class cabin snapped toward her, toward the woman who had just spoken her name with effortless authority. Owner of Blackwell Airlines. The realization rippled like a shockwave. Isadora Fenwick's breath hitched. Her body stiffened, her throat tightening as if the air around her had suddenly vanished. No, this wasn't possible. She had been so certain, so sure that this woman didn't belong in first class. And yet here she was, making a call to the very people who controlled the skies she worked under. Aurora remained composed, her voice steady as she spoke into the phone. "There's been an incident with a member of your in-flight crew," she said smoothly. "I'll be filing a formal report upon landing." Isadora opened her mouth, but no words came out. She felt her heartbeat hammering against her ribs, pounding in her ears so loudly that it drowned out the sound of everything else. Evangeline Caraway was the first to react, stepping forward cautiously. "Miss Blackwell," she said carefully, the name tasting foreign in her mouth. I'm so sorry." "I had no idea." Aurora lifted a hand, silencing her instantly. She wasn't interested in apologies, not yet. The passengers had gone from silent curiosity to full-blown shock. Some of them were now whispering frantically, exchanging wide-eyed glances. Lysander Wolf, who had been watching the entire exchange, let out a low chuckle under his breath. "Well, this just got interesting." Isadora finally found her voice, though it was shaky. "Ms. Blackwell," she stammered, "if I had known, you would have treated me differently." Aurora finished for her, her tone calm but sharp enough to cut through steel. Isadora's stomach twisted. This was it. She had been in the airline industry for over 15 years. She had dealt with demanding passengers, entitled customers, people who thought they were above rules, but never in her entire career had she ever mishandled a situation this badly, and she knew she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Aurora lowered her phone from her ear, letting the weight of the silence stretch between them. She didn't have to raise her voice. She didn't have to make a scene. Everyone was already witnessing her power without her even trying. The voice on the other end of the line finally spoke back, though only Aurora could hear it. She listened for a moment before responding. "Yes, I'll stay in my seat, but when we land, I expect an immediate meeting with the flight supervisor and corporate HR. And I want her." She gestured toward Isadora, without looking at her. Escorted off the plane upon arrival, Isadora felt her knees lock. "Wait," she blurted. "Please, Miss Blackwell, this was just a mistake." Aurora interrupted, tilting her head slightly. "That's what you called it earlier, isn't it?" Isadora's mouth opened, then closed. Aurora studied her, the silence stretching long enough to make the flight attendant wilt under her gaze. Then finally she spoke again, slow and deliberate. "Tell me," she said, her voice soft but lethal. "Why exactly did you think I wasn't supposed to be in this seat?" The entire cabin was watching now. No one was pretending to look away. Evangeline stood frozen, her fingers clutching the tray she had been holding earlier. Lysander Wolf leaned forward slightly, intrigued. Ophelia Ravenwood, the woman who had scoffed earlier, crossed her arms, her face filled with vindication. Isadora's face burned. She started. But she had nothing, no explanation, no excuse that wouldn't sound pathetic. In this moment, Aurora Blackwell didn't need to say anything else. She had already won, and Isadora Fenwick knew it. Isadora's breath came faster than she wanted it to. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, heavy and unforgiving. Every second that passed with Aurora Blackwell staring at her made it worse. She had always been the one in control, the one who called the shots, the one who kept things in order. But now she wasn't just losing control. She had already lost it. Passengers continued watching, their faces a mixture of shock, curiosity, and satisfaction. Some had already guessed why she had singled Aurora out in the first place, and now they were waiting to see if she would say it out loud. Aurora leaned back in her seat, her movements effortless, as if she had all the time in the world. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly, but it wasn't a smile. It was something far more dangerous. "I'm waiting," she said, tilting her head slightly. Isadora's mouth felt dry. She tried to swallow, but it was useless. What could she say that she hadn't assumed? Aurora didn't belong. That would be a lie, and saying the truth was career suicide. Evangeline Caraway, still standing nearby, looked deeply uncomfortable. She wasn't stupid. She had worked with Isadora long enough to know that she had a habit of making certain passengers feel unwelcome. Not the loud, obvious kind of discrimination, but the quiet, polite, on-the-surface kind. The kind that people like Aurora Blackwell noticed immediately. Isadora forced a breath through her nose. "I need to fix this now," she started, forcing her voice into something steadier. "I was just following standard procedures, Miss Blackwell. It had nothing to do with—" Aurora lifted a single brow, daring her to finish that sentence. Isadora stopped. Passengers were still watching. Some of them had their phones out now, recording. not obviously, but enough that she could see the way screens were angled, waiting for her next words, waiting to see if she would dig her own grave. Aurora let the silence stretch long enough to make Isadora's skin crawl. Then, with the same level tone, she spoke again. "You asked for my ticket," she said, tapping the armrest lightly. "Fine, maybe you were just being thorough." Isadora exhaled shakily. "Maybe this was my way out," she began, but Aurora continued. "You didn't ask for his." She gestured lightly toward Lysander Wolfe, who had been watching with open amusement. The older businessman lifted his champagne glass in a slight toast, as if to confirm that he indeed had not been questioned. Aurora's gaze flicked to the woman a few seats ahead, Ophelia Ravenwood, who crossed her arms, shaking her head. "Nope, she didn't ask me a thing." Aurora's gaze returned to Isadora. "Just me." Isadora felt her face heat up. Evangeline shifted uncomfortably beside her, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else but here. "So," Aurora said, her voice light but cutting through the air like a blade. "Tell me, what exactly made me the only passenger worth questioning?" Isadora's nails dug into the fabric of her uniform. She had no answer that wouldn't make this worse. Aurora didn't blink, she didn't look away. She was making Isadora sit with it. The shame, the humiliation, the weight of her own poorly calculated choice. Then, Aurora did something that made Isadora's stomach drop even further. She smirked. Just barely, she knew. She knew Isadora had no way out of this. Passengers were whispering now. Phones were still recording. And then Aurora spoke again, this time her voice smooth and effortless. "Tell me, Miss Fenwick," she said, using Isadora's name for the first time, making it sound like a death sentence. "What do you think happens when a flight attendant lays hands on the owner of an airline?" Isadora's entire body went cold because she already knew the answer. Her throat felt tight, her breathing shallow. The reality of what she had just done hit her like a collapsing building, slow at first, then all at once. The whispers around the cabin were growing louder, mixing with the soft hum of the engines. The passengers weren't just watching anymore, they were waiting for the fall. Evangeline's voice broke through the tension, quiet but firm. "Isadora," she said, barely above a whisper. "You need to step away," Isadora Fenwick said. Her fingers twitched at her sides. Step away. That was it. After 15 years of flawless service, one mistake, and suddenly she was the villain. No, she could fix this. She had to, Aurora Blackwell. Isadora forced out her voice, tense but controlled. I deeply regret if my actions have caused any misunderstanding. I was only trying to... Aurora interrupted smoothly, her expression unreadable. Isadora swallowed hard. Aurora tilted her head, waiting. The same unbearable silence stretched between them, dragging her down, drowning her. Lysander Wolfe chuckled from across the aisle, shaking his head. "Give it up," he muttered under his breath, but just loud enough for Isadora to hear. Ophelia Ravenwood let out a small scoff. "She's really trying to clean up her mess now." Isadora clenched her fists. "Miss Blackwell, You grabbed my arm." Aurora cut in. Isadora froze. The words weren't shouted. They weren't even spoken with anger, but the precision of them, the way they landed like a final undeniable fact, sealed everything. More whispers followed. The weight of passengers' eyes burned into Isadora's skin. Phones were still pointed, recording every last moment. Aurora turned slightly in her seat, looking at Evangeline Caraway. "Do you know what the standard policy is when a crew member touches a passenger unnecessarily?" Evangeline hesitated before answering, her voice quiet but certain. "It's grounds for immediate termination." Isadora's heart stopped. Aurora exhaled lightly. "So tell me, Miss Fenwick." She turned back to her, her smirk gone now, replaced with something colder. "Should I follow airline policy? Or should I make an exception?" Isadora opened her mouth. Panic surged through her veins. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't fair. I had to say something. I had to fix this. "Miss Blackwell, please," she finally said, her voice cracking, the first real crack in the wall of control she had built for herself. I wasn't thinking. I made a mistake. A terrible one." Aurora didn't respond right away. She let the moment hang, let Isadora sit in it. Then, slowly, she leaned forward just slightly. "I know," came the calm, final tone that shattered Isadora completely. Because that wasn't forgiveness. That was a verdict. And Isadora knew exactly what was waiting for her when this plane landed. Isadora's stomach churned as the full weight of her actions settled over her. Her uniform, once crisp and perfectly tailored, suddenly felt suffocating. The murmurs around her grew louder. Passengers exchanged knowing glances, their expressions ranging from amusement to disgust. She had lost control of the situation completely. Aurora Blackwell had never raised her voice, never lost her composure, never even demanded an apology. And that was what made it worse. Because now Isadora wasn't just a flight attendant trying to correct a mistake. She was the woman who had humiliated the owner of the airline and done it in front of a plane full of witnesses. Evangeline Caraway shifted beside her, clearing her throat. "Isadora," she said again, firmer this time. "You need to step away." Isadora felt like her feet were glued to the floor. She didn't get to finish as the intercom crackled to life, and the captain's voice filled the cabin, calm but commanding. "Isadora Fenwick, please report to the cockpit immediately." The murmur stopped. A sharp jolt of panic ran through Isadora's chest. No, this is happening too fast. Passengers turned to look at each other, their expressions shifting from curiosity to full-blown anticipation. Lysander Wolfe let out a low chuckle. "Oh, that's not good." Ophelia Ravenwood smirked. "She's cooked." Isadora's hands felt clammy. The entire plane was watching her downfall in real time. Her mind raced for a way out, a way to reverse the damage, to take control back. But there was no fixing this. Aurora Blackwell, still seated, exhaled lightly, glancing at her nails before speaking. "Low and controlled. I think they're waiting for you." That was it. That was all she said. But it was enough. Isadora Fenwick's breath hitched, her fingers twitching at her sides. The walk to the cockpit felt like a funeral march. Passengers didn't pretend not to watch anymore. They turned their heads, some smirking, some shaking their heads, some still secretly recording. Each step felt heavier than the last as she reached the cockpit door. Evangeline Caraway's voice followed her, soft but deadly. "You really should have just checked her ticket and moved on." Isadora Fenwick squeezed her eyes shut for half a second, her hands shaking as she pressed the intercom button. "This is Isadora Fenwick," she forced out. "Reporting to the cockpit." The door clicked open, and as she stepped inside, her career, her entire world hung by a single thread. Then the cockpit door closed behind Isadora Fenwick, with a quiet but decisive click. The small, dimly lit space was nothing like the first-class cabin she had just left. There were no watching passengers, no murmuring whispers, no recording phones. But somehow the silence felt heavier, worse. Everett Kingsley turned in his seat, his expression unreadable. He had been flying for over 2 decades, long enough to know that when corporate got involved in a mid-flight situation, someone's career was about to crash harder than any failed landing. Beside him, Dorian Ashcroft kept his eyes forward, his hands steady on the controls, but the tension in his posture was obvious. The in-flight phone was still connected, the faint static from the other end of the line humming through the small space. Isadora Fenwick didn't need to guess who was on the other side. Corporate had been notified. Everett Kingsley exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple before looking at her. "You've really done it this time, Fenwick." Isadora Fenwick's mouth felt dry. "Captain, she began, but he lifted a hand, cutting her off. "Sit," he said. She hesitated before obeying, lowering herself into the small fold-out seat near the door. "Do you have any idea who you just put your hands on?" the captain asked, his voice deceptively calm. Isadora Fenwick swallowed. I didn't know." "Not good enough." His voice hardened. Isadora Fenwick flinched slightly, gripping the edge of her uniform. Everett Kingsley leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "You know how many complaints I get from passengers who feel like they've been mistreated?" He let the question sit for a beat before answering it himself. "Too many, and most of them don't have the power to do anything about it." He narrowed his eyes at her. "But this time, you pick the one person who does." Isadora Fenwick's hands trembled in her lap. "You embarrassed the owner of the airline," the captain continued. "You questioned her, humiliated her, physically touched her. And you did it all in front of a plane full of witnesses." Isadora Fenwick's stomach churned. I was just enforcing policy." "No, you weren't," the captain cut in sharply. "You were enforcing your own bias, and now you're going to answer for it." The radio crackled. A new voice came through, calm but authoritative. "This is Benedict Thornfield, Senior Operations Manager. I've been briefed on the situation," Everett Kingsley said. "Captain Kingsley, please confirm if the crew member in question is in the cockpit." He pressed the in-flight phone to his ear. "She's here." A beat of silence passed, then Benedict Thornfield's voice returned, colder this time. "Isadora Fenwick, you are being relieved of duty, effective immediately." Isadora Fenwick stopped breathing. The captain watched her carefully, waiting for the reality to sink in. Her pulse pounded in her ears. "Relieved of duty mid-flight? That never happens," Benedict Thornfield continued, his voice unwavering. "Upon landing, you will be escorted off the aircraft and placed on administrative leave, pending a formal review with the airline's executive board." Isadora Fenwick's vision blurred. Her fingers dug into her skirt as she fought to steady her breath. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "This is my career. I didn't mean to." "Irrelevant," Benedict Thornfield said coldly. "A formal letter will be sent to your email within the hour outlining your next steps. Until then, I strongly advise you to remain professional and not create further disruption." Another silence. Then Benedict Thornfield spoke again, his words final. "We land in 30 minutes. I suggest you prepare for the consequences." The line went dead. Isadora Fenwick felt her chest tighten. She had spent 15 years flying, and now, in 15 minutes, she had thrown it all away. Everett Kingsley let out a long breath, shaking his head. "I suggest you take a seat in the back, Fenwick. You're a passenger now." Isadora Fenwick sat frozen, her entire world crumbling beneath her. Back in first class, Aurora Blackwell took another slow sip of her drink, waiting for the wheels to hit the ground. She wasn't done yet. Isadora Fenwick's steps felt heavy as she left the cockpit, every fiber of her being urging her to keep walking, to get to the back of the plane as quickly as possible, to disappear before the humiliation became unbearable. But it was already too late. The moment she stepped back into the first-class cabin, every single pair of eyes turned toward her. She could feel it, the silent judgment, the quiet smirks, the barely contained satisfaction, from passengers who had watched her fall from authority to nothing in a matter of minutes. She didn't dare make eye contact with Aurora Blackwell, not that it mattered. Aurora Blackwell didn't even look at her. That was worse. She wasn't worth her attention anymore. Isadora Fenwick's breath came in short, shallow bursts as she forced herself to move her feet, carrying her away from the front of the plane. The place she had ruled over for years. Evangeline Carraway was standing near the galley, arms crossed. She didn't say anything as Isadora Fenwick passed, but there was something in her expression that made Isadora Fenwick's stomach twist even further, with pity, and maybe a little bit of satisfaction. Finally, Isadora Fenwick reached the back of the plane. The space felt smaller than she remembered, more cramped, more suffocating. There was an empty seat near the rear exit, the same kind of seat she had once sent passengers to when she decided they didn't belong in first class. Now, it was hers. She sank into it, staring straight ahead, her hands gripping the armrest so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her career, her reputation, everything she had built was collapsing around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. At the front of the plane, Aurora Blackwell let out a quiet breath, stretching her legs slightly. Ophelia Ravenwood leaned over from her seat, raising an eyebrow, not even going to look at her. Aurora Blackwell smirked faintly. "She's not my problem anymore." Lysander Wolfe chuckled coldly. Aurora Blackwell picked up her phone, scrolling casually. Just business. And just like that, Isadora Fenwick ceased to exist. Not because Aurora Blackwell had to destroy her, but because she had already destroyed herself. The plane cruised steadily through the air, but for Isadora Fenwick it might as well have been plummeting. She sat stiffly in her cramped economy seat, her breathing shallow, her hands gripping her knees as if holding herself together. The murmur of conversations around her felt distant, as if she were underwater, drowning in the consequences of her actions. She didn't belong here. For 15 years she had walked through these aisles with authority. She had given orders, dictated the rules, ensured that everything in her section was exactly as it should be. She controlled the cabin. Now, she was just another passenger. No, it was worse than that. Passengers still had dignity. They still had the ability to get off this plane and go about their lives. Isadora Fenwick had no idea what was waiting for her when they landed. Her mind raced with what was coming, the formal review, the executive board, the end of her career. Because, let's be honest, there was no coming back from this. She could already see the headlines in her mind. Mirror Airline's flight attendant harasses owner in first class, then puts hands on her. She could already hear the corporate response. "We take incidents like this very seriously, and are committed to ensuring all passengers are treated with respect." She could already picture the press release. Effective immediately, Isadora Fenwick has been dismissed from her role with Mercer Airlines. Her stomach twisted violently. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was career suicide. And the worst part, she had done this to herself. A small voice in her head, the one she had ignored for years, whispered the truth. You thought she didn't belong there. You looked at her and assumed she was in the wrong seat. You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket, just her. And when you challenged her, you doubled down. And then you put your hands on her. Isadora Fenwick squeezed her eyes shut, swallowing down the rising nausea. This wasn't fair, but wasn't it? She thought. She didn't even need to turn around to know that Aurora Blackwell was still seated comfortably in first class, unfazed. That woman had barely lifted a finger, and yet she had taken everything from her. Not because of a tantrum, not because she had shouted or demanded some ridiculous compensation, but because she didn't have to. Because power doesn't need to scream. Isadora Fenwick flinched as she felt movement next to her. A flight attendant, Serafina, one of the newer crew members, had come up beside her, crouching slightly. "Isadora," she said in a quiet voice. Isadora turned her head slowly, hating how Serafina's tone sounded gentle, careful, as if she were already speaking to a former employee. Serafina hesitated. "I just wanted to check if you're okay." Isadora stiffened. No one had ever asked her that before. Not like this. She had spent her entire career making other people uncomfortable, and now here she was on the receiving end of it, with no idea how to handle it. "I'm fine," she said quickly. Too quickly. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, betraying her. Serafina hesitated before nodding. "We land in 15 minutes." Isadora already knew that she had been counting down the minutes. She said nothing. Serafina stood back up, pressing her lips together before walking away. Isadora's fingers twitched. 15 minutes. That was all she had left. 15 minutes before she stepped off this plane, not as a senior flight attendant, not as someone respected, not as someone who had control, but as a woman who had ruined everything in a matter of seconds. And when she stepped off that plane, she knew Aurora Blackwell would be waiting. Isadora barely heard the captain's voice over the intercom announcing, "The descent, ladies and gentlemen. We will be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all tray tables are in their upright positions. Cabin crew, prepare for arrival." The words barely registered. Her hands felt cold, her chest tight. 15 minutes. 14. Now, she didn't move. She didn't look around. She kept her gaze locked on the seat in front of her, staring blankly at the safety instructions tucked into the pocket. She had never been the kind of flight attendant who felt nervous before landing. But then again, she had never landed knowing she would walk off the plane in disgrace. Serafina passed by again, checking on passengers. This time, she didn't say anything to Isadora. She just gave her a small, unreadable glance before moving on. In first class, Aurora Blackwell sat comfortably. Her seat reclined slightly, and she sipped on what was left of her sparkling water. She was calm. She had been calm since the moment this started. Ophelia Ravenwood leaned in from her seat, unable to hide her smirk. "So what happens when we land?" Aurora Blackwell didn't look away from her phone. "She gets escorted off the plane." Lysander Wolfe chuckled from across the aisle. "That's it." Aurora finally glanced up, tilting her head slightly. "You want more?" Lysander shrugged. "You're the owner of the airline. You could have had her fired on the spot." And so Aurora Blackwell smiled faintly. "She fired herself the second she put her hands on me," Ophelia Ravenwood snorted. "She doesn't even realize how bad this is yet." "Oh, she will," Aurora murmured, locking her phone screen. "She will." The plane tilted slightly, signaling the final descent. Isadora Fenwick forced herself to focus on breathing in the outside air. She could feel eyes on her. She didn't need to look to know that people were watching. Some pretending not to, some openly staring. She had been the authority once, the one people feared, the one who enforced the rules, and now she was the lesson. The one who had let her own biases write the end of her career. She didn't even try to justify it anymore, because there was nothing to justify. She had made assumptions about Aurora Blackwell, not because she had done anything wrong, not because she had acted suspiciously, but because of the kind of person she had expected to see in first class. And when Aurora had pushed back, she had doubled down, and now here she was. The irony burned in her throat. The plane shuddered as the wheels hit the runway. A few passengers applauded softly, a habit on some flights. But this time the clapping felt different. It felt like the closing act of a very public downfall. A quiet hum of voices filled the cabin as the plane slowed. Isadora Fenwick could feel it, the anticipation. Everyone knew what was coming. Aurora Blackwell sat back in her seat, rolling her neck slightly before stretching her fingers. The game was over. The curtain was closing, and now it was time for consequences. The plane came to a full stop. The intercom clicked on one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The local time is 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. Thank you for flying with us." Ding, the seatbelt sign switched off. Passengers moved immediately, grabbing bags, stretching, adjusting their jackets. Isadora Fenwick didn't move. She didn't dare, because standing at the front of the plane, waiting just outside the door, were two uniformed security officers. And in the first row of first class, Aurora Blackwell finally stood up. She wasn't done yet. Isadora Fenwick stayed frozen in her seat, her heart pounding against her ribs, her fingers digging into her lap as she stared at the seat in front of her. She knew what was waiting for her outside that plane, and the worst part was that there was no escape. The aisle filled with passengers grabbing their bags, stretching after the long flight, whispering amongst themselves. But there was no mistaking the fact that many of them weren't just preparing to leave. They were waiting to see what would happen to her. Aurora Blackwell moved effortlessly, standing tall, adjusting the sleeve of her blazer as she stepped into the aisle. Calm, unbothered, untouchable. She had won this game before it even started. And Isadora Fenwick? Isadora Fenwick had already lost. Ophelia Ravenwood leaned toward Aurora Blackwell slightly, speaking just loud enough for Isadora Fenwick to hear. "Bet she's regretting that little power trip now." Lysander Wolf smirked. "Oh, she hasn't even hit the worst part yet." Isadora Fenwick clenched her jaw. She refused to look at them. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing just how broken she felt. Evangeline Caraway appeared near the front of the plane, avoiding Isadora Fenwick's gaze as she spoke to Aurora Blackwell. "Security is ready," she said quietly. Aurora Blackwell simply nodded, as if she expected nothing less. Passengers slowly began filing off one by one, but Isadora Fenwick knew she wouldn't be among them. She would be the last. She would be escorted, she would be paraded, through the terminal like a warning sign. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. Aurora Blackwell moved forward, her heels clicking against the cabin floor as she approached the exit. When she reached the front, she paused briefly, turning her head just enough to speak over her shoulder. Isadora Fenwick's breath caught. This was it. This was her reckoning. Slowly, painfully, she forced herself to look up. Aurora Blackwell held her gaze. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat, and she didn't need to. Instead, she said something far worse. "I want you to remember this moment," Aurora Blackwell said smoothly, her voice carrying power with no effort at all. Isadora Fenwick swallowed hard, not because of what's happening to her, but because of what she had done to herself. Silence, deep and unforgiving, followed. Then, Aurora Blackwell turned away, stepping off the plane, as if none of this had ever affected her in the first place. Isadora Fenwick felt something crack inside her, because Aurora Blackwell was right. This wasn't just about what Aurora Blackwell had done to her. It was about what she had done to herself. A moment later, a firm voice spoke from the front of the plane. "Isadora Fenwick." She stiffened as the security officers turned their heads slightly. Two men in Navy uniforms, calm, professional but firm, addressed her. She swallowed down the lump in her throat. "You need to come with us." Passengers stopped pretending not to watch. This was what they had been waiting for. Isadora Fenwick had no choice. Her legs shook as she stood, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. Every step toward the front of the plane felt heavier than the last. She walked past the seats she had once ruled over, past the passengers who had once feared her authority, past Evangeline Caraway, whose lips were pressed into a tight line, past the first-class cabin where Aurora Blackwell had sat, unbothered, powerful, untouchable. And then finally, she stepped off the plane. The bright lights of the terminal hit her like a spotlight. And waiting just a few feet ahead, a man in a dark suit, expression unreadable, posture unshaken, Benedict Thornfield, Senior Operations Manager, stood. His judgment was waiting. The terminal air felt different, colder, heavier. Isadora Fenwick stepped off the plane, flanked by the two uniformed security officers, and the world around her seemed to slow down. Eyes followed her every movement. Some passengers had already moved on, disappearing into the airport corridors. Others lingered, not out of concern, not out of curiosity, but to watch. She was no longer a flight attendant, no longer the one in charge. She was the scandal, the show, the downfall. Benedict Thornfield stood near the gate, his sharp suit neatly pressed, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't frown, didn't scowl, didn't glare. That would have been mercy. Instead, he looked at her with the kind of calm indifference that told her exactly where she stood. She was nothing now. "Isadora Fenwick," he said, his voice smooth but heavy, final. She swallowed hard. "Mr. Thornfield, she began. "Walk with me. No negotiation, no option." Isadora Fenwick hesitated for half a second, but she knew she had no choice. A security officer stepped aside as Benedict Thornfield turned on his heel, already leading the way through the terminal. She followed, her legs feeling like lead. The airport bustled with life, passengers hurrying toward their gates, families greeting loved ones, business travelers checking their phones. None of it felt real. All Isadora Fenwick could feel was the crushing weight of each step. They walked in silence past the bustling crowds, past the flight information screens flickering with schedules, past the familiar sight of crew members in crisp uniforms. She had walked this same path dozens, maybe hundreds of times before. But this time it wasn't her terminal anymore. They reached a set of frosted glass doors. Benedict Thornfield swiped his ID badge, and they slid open without hesitation, leading into a quiet, restricted corridor. The world behind them faded. No more passengers, no more whispers. Just a long hallway with a single meeting room at the end. Isadora Fenwick's breathing hitched. She knew this room. She had seen other employees walk in over the years, and none of them had walked out the same. Benedict Thornfield stepped inside, motioning toward a chair. "Sit," he said. Isadora Fenwick hesitated. "I won't say it again." Her throat tightened as she moved forward, lowering herself onto the seat. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Benedict Thornfield sat across from her, folding his hands over a neat stack of papers. He took his time flipping through the first few pages. Isadora Fenwick tried to steady her breath, but the silence was unbearable. Finally, he spoke. "Do you know how many reports I have in front of me?" She swallowed. He didn't let her finish. 17, he said, flipping another page. 17 witness statements, some from passengers, some from crew members. Even the pilot filed one. Isadora Fenwick's blood turned to ice. Benedict Thornfield continued. "Each statement confirms that you questioned a first-class passenger without cause, dismissed a valid ticket, and escalated a situation that should have never happened." Isadora Fenwick opened her mouth, maybe to defend herself, maybe to beg. But he didn't stop, and then he said, his voice still eerily calm, "You put your hands on her." Isadora Fenwick flinched. Benedict Thornfield leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "I need you to understand something, Fenwick. This isn't just about the fact that you humiliated a passenger. This isn't just about you being unprofessional." He let the silence stretch for a moment. Then his next words came like a sentence being handed down. "You put your hands on Aurora Blackwell." Isadora Fenwick's body locked up. Benedict Thornfield tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Let me say that again in case you didn't grasp it the first time." He leaned in just slightly. You laid hands on the owner of this airline." Isadora Fenwick's pulse thundered in her ears. Benedict Thornfield exhaled, leaning back and tapping his fingers against the file in front of him. "Do you have anything to say?" Her lips parted, but no words came. What could she say that she didn't know had been a mistake? That she hadn't meant to put her hands on the single most powerful woman in the company? None of it would save her. None of it would even help. She had spent years keeping order, making passengers feel small when she felt like they didn't belong. And now she was the one who did. Benedict Thornfield tapped the file one last time before flipping it closed. "The board has already made their decision," he said simply. Isadora Fenwick's stomach turned. Benedict Thornfield pushed a single sheet of paper across the table. She didn't need to read the words to know what it said, but she read them anyway. Effective immediately, Isadora Fenwick is permanently dismissed from Mercer Airlines. This decision is final. Any attempts to contest this termination will be denied. It was over. Just like that. 15 years, gone. Benedict Thornfield stood, gathering the rest of his paperwork. "You have 5 minutes to clear out your belongings from company storage," he said. "Your ID badge has been deactivated. You are no longer permitted in any restricted areas of this airport." Isadora Fenwick stared at the paper. She had known this was coming. She had known from the second Aurora Blackwell had spoken her name, but knowing didn't make it any easier. Benedict Thornfield gave her one last look, unreadable, before heading toward the door. He paused just before leaving, speaking without turning around. "One last thing, Isadora." She barely lifted her eyes. "You didn't just lose your job today, Fenwick." His voice was steady, calm, but final. "You lost your entire career." Then the door closed behind him, and Isadora Fenwick was officially nothing. Isadora Fenwick sat in the empty room, staring at the termination letter in front of her. Her hands shook. The words blurred together, the ink smudging as her vision wavered. She wasn't crying. Not yet. The shock hadn't fully hit her. Effective immediately, permanently dismissed, no right to contest. Each phrase felt like a fresh cut, as if she were reading her own obituary. Her mouth was dry. Her uniform, the same one she had worn with pride and authority for years, now felt foreign on her body. It was no longer hers. Nothing was. The silence in the room was deafening. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. 15 years, gone. Not just this job, but all jobs. Because who would hire a flight attendant fired for humiliating and laying hands on the owner of an airline? Her career wasn't just over, it was erased. A sharp knock on the door snapped her out of her trance. Isadora Fenwick's breath hitched as the door pushed open and a woman stepped inside. She froze. Aurora Blackwell. For a split second, neither of them spoke. Isadora Fenwick's fingers twitched over the paper. She didn't dare move. Aurora Blackwell's posture was relaxed, as if she had all the time in the world. She wore the same effortless confidence she had on the plane, but now it felt heavier, more final. Isadora Fenwick had never felt small before. Until now. Aurora Blackwell took a slow step forward, letting the door close softly behind her. Isadora Fenwick's pulse thundered. "Why are you here?" Aurora Blackwell didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at the papers on the table. "I assume Benedict Thornfield delivered the news?" Isadora Fenwick swallowed. "You?" Her voice cracked, but she forced the words out. "You got what you wanted." Aurora Blackwell lifted a brow, almost amused. "Did I?" Isadora Fenwick's nails dug into her palms. "You ruined me at that." Aurora Blackwell finally smiled. A slow, deliberate smirk. "No, Isadora Fenwick," she said, her voice soft but cutting like a blade. "You ruined yourself." Isadora Fenwick's throat tightened. I didn't know who you were." Aurora Blackwell's smile didn't waver. "You didn't need to," she said. Isadora Fenwick blinked, her breath hitching. Aurora Blackwell tilted her head slightly. "Tell me, if I had been just another passenger, would you still be sitting here?" Isadora Fenwick knew the answer. And that was the worst part, because the answer was no. If Aurora Blackwell had been just another passenger, if she hadn't been the owner of Mercer Airlines, Isadora Fenwick would have gotten away with it like she always had. The weight of that truth sat between them, cold and undeniable. Isadora Fenwick had never questioned another first-class passenger. She hadn't doubted Lysander Wolfe. She hadn't doubted Ophelia Ravenwood. But when Aurora Blackwell sat there quietly minding her business, she had assumed she didn't belong, and that was what had destroyed her. Aurora Blackwell watched the emotions flicker across Isadora Fenwick's face. "You understand now." Isadora Fenwick clenched her fists. "So what, you came here to rub it in?" Aurora Blackwell exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "No, Isadora Fenwick. I came here to make sure you understand exactly what you lost." Isadora Fenwick looked away, unable to hold her gaze any longer. Aurora Blackwell stepped closer, her voice lowering. "Let me tell you what's going to happen next." Isadora Fenwick forced herself to meet her eyes. "You're going to leave this room. You're going to clear out your things. And when you walk out of this airport, you won't be walking back in." Isadora Fenwick's stomach twisted. "You're not just banned from working for Mercer Airlines." Aurora Blackwell continued slowly, ruthlessly. "I've personally ensured that every major airline knows your name. Every single one." Isadora Fenwick's chest tightened painfully. Her breath came in shaky, uneven bursts. Aurora Blackwell leaned in slightly, just enough to make sure her next words landed. "You're never flying again." Isadora Fenwick's breath stopped. The room felt smaller, her throat burned. Aurora Blackwell pulled back slightly, giving her a long, measured look. "Look, you spent years making passengers feel like they didn't belong," she murmured. "How does it feel, knowing you'll never belong here again?" The words shattered something inside Isadora Fenwick. For the first time since this started, since she realized what was happening, she truly felt it. This wasn't just a job, it was her life. And it was over. Aurora Blackwell let the silence hang before turning toward the door. She reached for the handle, then paused, looking over her shoulder. Isadora Fenwick swallowed. "I wasn't even going to fire you at first." Her breath hitched. Bored. Aurora Blackwell smiled faintly. "You could have just apologized, could have taken accountability." She shook her head slightly. "But you doubled down. You thought you were untouchable." Her gaze sharpened. "So, I touched you." Isadora Fenwick's chest tightened. Aurora Blackwell didn't wait for a response. She stepped through the door, letting it close softly behind her. Isadora Fenwick couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The finality of it all crashed over her. Her career wasn't just gone. Her entire identity was gone. She wasn't Isadora Fenwick, the senior flight attendant. She wasn't the enforcer of rules. She was nothing. And Aurora Blackwell had walked away from this with everything. Isadora Fenwick finally let out a shaky breath, and for the first time, she truly felt powerless. She sat in the silent room long after Aurora Blackwell had walked out. Her body refused to move. Her brain refused to accept reality. She had spent the last 15 years flying across the world, controlling the aisles, enforcing the rules, deciding who was worthy of comfort and who wasn't. The uniform she wore had once given her power. Now, it was nothing more than fabric. And soon, it wouldn't even be hers. The security officers outside the door didn't come in to rush her, but she could feel them there, waiting, watching. She knew what came next. She would walk through the halls of this airport for the last time, carrying her things in a small box, just like every other employee who had been escorted out before her. Only this time it would be different, because everyone would know why. Her name had already spread across Mercer Airlines. The whispers had already reached corporate offices. The story had already started leaking to other airlines. Aurora Blackwell hadn't just taken her job. She had taken her career, her future, her identity. And yet, Isadora Fenwick knew the truth. Aurora Blackwell didn't take anything. She had handed it over the moment she assumed Aurora Blackwell didn't belong in first class. The shame of it hit her like turbulence she had embraced, for she had been so confident, so sure that she was doing the right thing when she first questioned Aurora Blackwell on the plane. She had thought she was maintaining order. She had thought she was upholding the rules. But deep down, she knew she had seen a wealthy, powerful black woman sitting in first class, and she had doubted her. That was the real reason she had asked for the ticket. That was the real reason she had pushed back even after seeing it. And that was the real reason she had laid her hands on her, a death-desperate attempt to reclaim control in a situation where she had already lost it. And now she had lost everything. Her throat burned as she clenched her hands into fists, nails digging into her skin. She had seen this happen to other crew members, those who had been caught mistreating passengers, attendants who had let their egos cost them their jobs. But she had never thought it would be her, because she had always believed she was untouchable. She had spent her career walking past economy passengers who barely got a second glance, handing out barely forced smiles to those in first class, deciding in her own mind who deserved to be there and who didn't. And now, she didn't deserve to be anywhere. Her fingers trembled as she reached up, undoing the first button of her uniform shirt, then the second, then the third. By the time she reached the last one, she was shaking so badly she could barely move. She slid the fabric off her shoulders, folding it neatly and placing it on the table in front of her. It felt like removing her entire existence. Her ID badge came next. She had worn it clipped to her uniform for years, flashing it with confidence as she moved through restricted areas, walking with the authority that came with knowing she was above everyone else. Now, it was a useless piece of plastic. She unclipped it, letting it rest on top of the shirt. The finality of it was unbearable. Her eyes burned. She wouldn't cry. She refused to, for crying was weakness. But as she sat there, staring at the uniform she had worn, with pride, arrogance, power, she realized she had never felt weaker in her life. A knock on the door startled her. She flinched, blinking rapidly as she tried to push the emotion back down. A deep voice followed. She recognized the voice immediately. Maylie, Benedict Thornfield. Of course, he had been watching the entire time. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay steady. Yes. A pause. Security is ready to escort you out. Her stomach twisted. There it was. The final nail in her coffin. She inhaled sharply through her nose, squaring her shoulders as she stood. Even now, even as a woman who had lost everything, she still had her pride. She wouldn't let them see her break. She grabbed her things, what little she had left, and moved toward the door. Her fingers hesitated on the handle one last moment, one last breath. Then she stepped out, and the world she had once ruled over kept moving without her. The airport hallway stretched in front of Isadora Fenwick like a path she never wanted to walk. Each step forward felt like she was walking deeper into her own failure. Not just the failure of this job, but of everything she had built her identity around. Two security officers walked on either side of her, not gripping her arms, not restraining her, but guiding her toward the inevitable. a public escort, a walk of shame, the final humiliation. As she moved, she could feel the stares. She could feel the shift in the air around her, the subtle whispers that weren't subtle at all. That's her, the flight attendant who grabbed Aurora Blackwell. She had lost her job, lost everything. Her jaw clenched, she kept her head high, her posture rigid. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She wouldn't fall apart, not here, not yet. The exit doors loomed ahead, the cool glow of daylight pouring through the glass outside. The world continued as if nothing had happened, as if she had never existed in this space at all. She was almost at the doors when she heard it. A voice, low, smooth, and powerful. "Leaving so soon?" Aurora Blackwell. Isadora Fenwick stopped cold. The air in her lungs vanished slowly. She turned, and there she was. Aurora Blackwell stood near a sleek black car parked by the curb, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The chauffeur held the door open, waiting for her to step inside. But Aurora Blackwell hadn't moved. She was waiting for something else. For this. For Isadora Fenwick. The two women locked eyes. One with nothing left. One with everything. Isadora Fenwick's throat was dry, but she refused to look away. Aurora Blackwell took a slow step forward, her heels clicking lightly against the polished floor. "I wanted to see if you'd actually make it this far," she said, her voice smooth and effortless. Isadora Fenwick exhaled sharply through her nose. "I didn't have a choice," she murmured. Aurora Blackwell smirked. "You didn't." A silence stretched between them. Around them, people still moved. Passengers rushing to their flights, airline staff pushing carts of luggage, crew members heading toward their gates. But for Isadora Fenwick, the world had narrowed down to this moment. The woman she had tried to humiliate. The woman who had destroyed her. Aurora Blackwell studied her for a moment, tilting her head slightly. "You still don't get it, do you?" Isadora Fenwick's fingers twitched. "Get what?" Aurora Blackwell let out a slow breath. "You thought I fired you because you grabbed my arm," she said. Isadora Fenwick stiffened. "Didn't you?" Aurora Blackwell shook her head, almost as if she patted her. "No, Isadora Fenwick. I fired you because you would have done this to anyone." "You didn't just question me because I was in first class," Aurora Blackwell continued. "You questioned me because you didn't expect me to be there." Isadora Fenwick's stomach twisted violently. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted to tell Aurora Blackwell that she wasn't that kind of person, that she didn't judge people based on anything other than policy, that this was a misunderstanding, that she had made a mistake. But the truth was already there. She had always been this person, and Aurora Blackwell knew it. Aurora Blackwell stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough so that only Isadora Fenwick could hear. "You could have let me sit there in peace," she said, her tone soft but cutting like a razor. "But you couldn't." Isadora Fenwick swallowed hard, her hands shaking at her sides. "You saw a woman sitting in first class, and you needed to remind her that she wasn't yours." Aurora Blackwell's chest tightened. "You lost your job because you didn't treat me like a customer," Aurora Blackwell said. "True. You treated me like a mistake." The words landed with brutal finality. Isadora Fenwick couldn't breathe because she knew what she already knew. Aurora Blackwell was right, and it had cost her everything. Aurora Blackwell exhaled lightly, finally stepping back. "I wonder," she mused, "if you had known who I was from the start, would you have treated me differently?" Isadora Fenwick's mouth opened, but nothing came out. It didn't matter. The answer was yes, she would have. Aurora Blackwell gave a slow, knowing nod. "That's the problem. The truth hits harder than any termination letter ever could. Isadora Fenwick's chest ached. She felt herself crumbling, breaking apart from the inside, unraveling under the weight of her own choices. And Aurora Blackwell. She didn't need Aurora Blackwell to do anything else. She had already won. Without another word, Aurora Blackwell turned away. She stepped toward her waiting car, sliding into the back seat without hesitation. The chauffeur closed the door behind her, and within seconds, the car pulled away from the curb, blending into the steady stream of traffic. Isadora Fenwick watched it disappear. She stood there alone, her entire career, her entire identity, her entire world gone. And for the first time in her life, she realized something. She had spent years making people feel like they didn't belong, and now she didn't belong anywhere. The security officer beside her shifted. "Let's go," he said. Isadora Fenwick turned back to the exit, and then, with no job, no career, no power, and no future, she walked through the doors of the airport for the last time. This story teaches a powerful lesson about the destructive nature of prejudice and unchecked arrogance, demonstrating that assumptions based solely on appearances can lead to catastrophic consequences. When someone in a position of authority allows personal biases to override objective judgment, it not only undermines their credibility, but also causes irreversible damage to their career and identity. The flight attendant's relentless need to assert control, born from deep-seated insecurities and the belief that she was untouchable, ended in a very public downfall. Her failure to treat every passenger with equal respect, regardless of their status, ultimately led to her humiliation and complete isolation. Moreover, the narrative shows that true power lies not in imposing one's will on others, but in maintaining professionalism, humility, and accountability. The repercussions she faced highlight that even a lifetime of authority can crumble in an instant when personal ego and prejudice go unchecked. Ultimately, the story serves as a cautionary reminder that respect, fairness, and self-awareness are essential in any role, and that neglecting these values can result in the loss of everything one has worked so hard to build. That concludes our story, but now I'm eager to hear from you. What are your thoughts on these events? Do you believe the flight attendant's punishment was justified, or did it go too far? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more captivating and unforgettable stories. Stay tuned for more exciting content coming your way. See you in the next one.